So, everyone's always like, oh, when is China going to invade Taiwan? And there's a whole bunch of dates that get thrown around, but nobody really knows for sure.
All right, I definitely heard it was 2027.
2027. It's definitely 2027.
I also heard 2023.
Or 2025?
It's when you least expect it. But so I think the better question is, what should we be looking for as a sign that an invasion is imminent?
Well, I guess the way I would answer that is, it strikes me, if I were Xi, which I am clearly not, I would do everything in my power to make sure that if the invasion were imminent, that wouldn't be telegraphed far in advance. And so this is, I think, one of the challenges, and something I've been working on for a number of years, is this idea that Taiwan, and maybe to a lesser degree Washington, really have bought into this idea that we will have early warning indicators months, maybe even years in advance. And that would be nice if it's true, but I don't know that we should organize all of our planning and our mindset around that. Rather, we should expect to be surprised, and our plans should be in place so that if that is indeed what happens, we're ready for it.
Maybe have a aircraft carrier strike group just permanently stationed in the area.
Well, I mean, we could agree to disagree on the utility of an aircraft carrier in that scenario, because I think either way it becomes a coral reef pretty quickly. But in my mind, really the key is to make sure that Taiwan is ready, because chances are, for all sorts of reasons, we're going to have to surge into theater. So what I've really been trying to focus on is what can we do to inoculate Taiwan against surprise so that it can hold the door open for the U.S. to show up when and if this happens.
I definitely want to talk about that, but just go back to the idea about like early warning. Wouldn't there still be, like, China has to move troops? Like, we would see that, right?
For sure, there will be indicators, but I think if we have learned one thing, certainly from the ongoing war in the Middle East, it's the fact that strategic surprise is still possible. And in particular, and this kind of ties back into Taiwanese sort of mental and cultural readiness for a worst case scenario, China does have options such that it might be able to get some sort of a running start. Yes, we might be able to detect some of these indicators, but some of those indicators may themselves be ambiguous. So we could think about major exercises where you've slowly but surely been stockpiling munitions and moving people into place, and that big exercise, maybe you've done a few of these things and it kind of lulls people into a sense of complacency. And then you could start from an exercise in a way that would make it much more difficult. Again, difficult if you're not prepared.
Right. So looking at how, for example, Russia invaded Ukraine, they'd been doing, training exercises along the border, totally innocuous. And there were a lot of people were at the time writing, oh, there's no way Russia's going to actually invade Ukraine, because that would be silly. That hasn't happened in a few years.
A few years. Okay. Yeah.
No, and this is the boiling frog approach that I think concerns some of us. This idea that if you hold enough of these big joint sword exercises and you do this for some number of months or years, you're just going to play into this this sense of complacency that largely exists in Taiwan, but to some degree also in Washington. That this is just the Chinese. They're just rattling the saber again. We know that Xi really wants to win without fighting, as though there's anyone in the world who wants to fight without winning. And then suddenly that morphs into something else. We would be lucky, I think, if Xi finds himself in a position that Putin did, and he gives us months and months and months and months of early warning indicators, and maybe does something like Putin did in Crimea, where he grabs some offshore island years in advance, giving us plenty of warning about his true intentions and giving Taiwan the alarm bell that, hey, you need to take this thing seriously. But again, I would like to plan for a worst case scenario, not a best case scenario. And the worst case scenario is, of course, that Xi has learned something from Putin.
So what would the worst case scenario actually look like?
So in my estimation, the worst case scenario is an all-out invasion, but an all-out invasion in which we've had this kind of steady drumbeat for some long period of time that has just lulled us all into thinking, it's never really going to happen. And then one that is at the earliest stages, sort of a shock and awe type campaign, where we do see a lot of rapid movement. We see long-range missile strikes. But I think the nightmare scenario that really keeps me up at, night, because it's a nightmare, is that Xi has already managed to put a lot of stuff on Formosa. And the idea that if he has some sizable footprint already on the island, some fifth column, some units, special forces that he can activate, combined then with things that he can insert in the earliest phases of a conflict, I think Taiwan and the Ministry of National Defense have so convinced the Taiwanese people that the only way China could invade is a World War II D-Day style invasion across the Taiwan Strait, and that Taiwan's military is ready to make sure that no Chinese boots ever actually hit the ground, hit the beach. That just the idea of missile strikes combined with PLA forces that are already on the island in the earliest phases might be too much for the Taiwanese people and the Taiwanese leadership to withstand.
How big is the PLA's fifth column, do you estimate?
No idea. And again, this comes back to my idea that defense establishments, they exist to plan for the worst case scenario. Whatever that worst case scenario is, I hope that that's the one that we're organizing around. My fear is that we have this caricatured idea that there'll really be no interference behind friendly lines, that there will be months and months and months of early warning, and that basically we can just flock all of our defensive capabilities to the beaches, looking over the iron sights, waiting for them to come across the Taiwan Strait. I would agree at the end of the day, the bulk of the occupation force will have to come over the Taiwan Strait. But my guess is that Xi will do everything he can to erode and undermine resistance from within before he mounts that phase of the campaign.
My understanding is that's how the successful takeover of Hainan Island happened in, was it 49 or 50 when the CCP took that from the nationalists?
Yeah, I think it does not take a leap of strategic creativity to see that if you were in Xi's shoes, you're really going to try to undermine defenses, both physically but also mentally, before you actually mount the main phase of the invasion. And I think the best historical analogy I can think of, the one that really concerns me the most, is actually France in 1940. This idea that on paper, it looked like a pretty capable organization. Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense, on paper, looks like a pretty capable organization. But when the German attack looked nothing like what the French prepared for, you just see this cognitive implosion, the sort of dominoes quickly collapsing in on itself. And then an organization which actually really still had the wherewithal to fight kind of gave up in a matter of weeks.
So you think the enemies may already be inside the gate. How do you defend against that? Like, I can see why you say an aircraft carrier is not useful, and that's kind of a situation.
So this is why, I and several others have been really arguing for a whole of society defense, because that really gives you two things. And I can go into the technical details of what I mean. But in essence, yes, an active duty military force that's sizable and capable and well trained and well equipped. Yes, a reserve force that can be mobilized quickly. And Taiwan's reserve force cannot be mobilized quickly. And that can be mobilized under fire, because almost assuredly, if the full invasion's coming, it's going to be, prefaced with long range strikes, cyber and kinetic. But I think all of this has to have a backstop. And that backstop, in my estimation, needs to come from what, by lack of a better term, we would call a territorial defense force. This idea of young men and women in Taiwan who haven't necessarily joined the formal active duty military, but who have still received a level of combat training. They are organized and prepared to defend their homes, because I think this really does two things for you. First, it actually prepares you so that if there are fifth columns, if there are boots already on the ground, or even if those things don't happen, if the PLA manages to make a lodgment, which I think is reasonable to assess that they will, there is an ability to defend in depth. And again, we're talking in the cities and the streets and the homes. The second piece, though, which I think is almost more important to the physical ability to be able to repel these sorts of incursions and intrusions, is just the mental and cognitive wherewithal to just have faith and confidence that, yes, I am capable of defending my neighborhood, I am capable of defending my family, that this is not a fool's errand, and that we can resist for as long as we need to, the key being need to, in order to hold the door open for U.S. forces to arrive.